Hi everyone, my name is Lisa Conte. I'm the founder and CEO of Jaguar Health and our wholly owned subsidiary Napo Pharmaceuticals. Throughout the presentation, I might use Jaguar and Napo interchangeably. So let's get started here. The slide's not moving. There we go. Okay, and we have forward-looking statements, and we'll jump right into it. So what we do here at Jaguar Health is all our discovery is from plants used traditionally in tropical areas, leveraging the knowledge of healers and shamans in rainforest areas to do more efficient drug discovery and development. And our mission here is to have new ways, novel mechanisms of action for plant-based medicines, first-in-class plant-based medicines for gastrointestinal disorders. And recently, we've added a focus on mental health disorders as well. And I'm quite pleased to say we have done what about 1 in 2,000 biotech companies is able to do. We took a product all the way from our discovery process, a tree growing in the rainforest, to this first-in-class FDA-approved medicine, Mytesi. It is in fact plant-based, it's natural, it's organic, it's fair trade, it's sustainably supplied, and it is an FDA-approved drug. And it is the only drug approved, the only oral drug approved by the FDA under botanical guidance, which provides an exclusivity advantage that we'll talk about later on. Mytesi is approved for the specialty market indication of HIV-related diarrhea, specifically the symptomatic relief of non-infectious diarrhea in adults with HIV/AIDS on antiretroviral therapy. It is a chronic indication, and as such, we do have chronic safety. Behind this product, safety is a huge hallmark associated with the product. And as I mentioned, it's a first-in-class anti-secretory agent. What's really wonderful about Mytesi is that it is a pipeline within a product. So it's approved now in the United States for HIV-related diarrhea. We have a whole line of pipeline follow-on indications, most of which we have phase 2 data for or proof of concept data in either humans or animals. And this includes the most advanced cancer therapy-related diarrhea, which is in a phase 3 single pivotal trial right now with agreement from the FDA. Diarrhea predominant irritable bowel syndrome, for which we have several published studies, phase 2 studies. Idiopathic functional diarrhea, there are 2 investigator-initiated trials going on right now in that indication. Supportive care for IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, colitis, and obviously the safety that we have in place is supportive of that indication. We do have a pediatric, highly concentrated liquid formulation for rare disorders of congenital diarrheal disease in a pediatric population, and also short bowel syndrome, for which we have orphan designation. We have a second generation anti-secretory agent called crofelemer, which is in development now for cholera, targeting a tropical disease priority review voucher as the return opportunity. I'll be talking more about that later. And we do have an early stage discovery program following the footsteps of what we did to discover and commercialize crofelemer Mytesi, and that's called Entheogen Therapeutics Initiative, and that's focusing on our psychoactive and psychedelic plants for mental health disorders and mood disorders. What I skipped over here is where I'm going to focus the beginning of the presentation, is inflammatory diarrhea, specifically to be studied in a long hauler chronic COVID patient population in Europe. And so let's talk about that right now. There is a subsidiary which we are setting up right now called Napo EU. It's in the process of being incorporated in Italy. The only reason it's not currently incorporated in Italy is because of pandemic necessitated office closures and reduced working hours that just made this a little bit longer of a process to happen. And the foundation, the cornerstone of why that is being incorporated in Italy is where we are going to be pursuing what we're calling a COVID-related diarrhea indication. And we'll be pursuing that in Europe, primarily through the EMA, but also working with the Swiss and the UK regulatory authorities. And we are also a possible target company, Napo EU, for an international SPAC. SPACs in Europe, specifically in Italy, are able to name their target company while they are out raising their funds, unlike the situation in the United States. So we are already associated with interest as a target for a SPAC. So what is COVID-related diarrhea, often referred to as long hauler, post-infectious diarrhea, chronic COVID? This is a long hauler syndrome, which is a constellation of symptoms, typically chronic or chronic episodic, in patients that have recovered from their COVID-19 infection. So these symptoms include gastrointestinal distress, of which diarrhea is the most common, fatigue, brain fog, cardiovascular effects, arthritis. It could be some or all of these symptoms. And it appears to be due to a whole body overreaction of the patient's immune system. And interestingly, it's occurring primarily in younger patients, 20, 30, 40-year-olds, and typically those who had mild disease, asymptomatic disease, didn't even necessarily know that they were infected with COVID-19. And also, the syndrome is being defined real time, and it's only the infection has only been with us a little over a year now. And so what we're seeing is studies popping up all over the world that are noticing the same type of syndrome, the same type of symptoms, and they're sort of being stitched together in defining this long hauler syndrome. What's interesting about gastrointestinal effects, and particularly diarrhea, is it's observable. And so while there may be inflammation, for example, in the cardiovascular area, you may not know that until you have a cardiovascular event, but everybody can observe the symptom of diarrhea. And managing that is not only important for early diagnosis, patient comfort, patient dignity, but also the health implications associated when you have chronic diarrhea, when you have chronic inflammation, and that can lead to inappropriate absorption of your minerals, your vitamins, your nutrition. Long hauler syndrome is still being defined in the United States, and that probably has a lot to do with insurance companies and pre-existing conditions. It is well defined throughout Europe, and there are dozens, if not even more, of clinics throughout Europe that are specifically focusing on the chronic long hauler syndrome and symptoms that patients are dealing with. Now, Mytesi, which is approved only for one indication right now in the United States, which is HIV-related diarrhea, within the HIV population, patients who are over the age, typically over the age of 50, typically have been infected with the virus for more than 10 years, have something called enteropathy, which is, again, a whole body inflammation that results in inflammation of their GI tract and leaky gut chronic diarrhea. It also leads to, from the inflammation throughout the whole body, accelerated aging, early cancers, early diabetes, for example, early chronic diseases. So it's a situation that we find remarkably analogous to what's being defined in the COVID-related inflammatory diarrhea potential indication. So what does this population look like? You almost can't keep up with it. Every day there's new information about a new variant, mutations, more infectious, larger number of people getting infected, larger number of people getting infected before they can get a vaccine. Is there going to be some compromise in the natural antibodies? Is the vaccine going to be as effective as it was in clinical trials? I think it was summed up nicely last week. The Moderna CEO said, the world will have to live with COVID forever. There is one study that came out very recently that is a systematic third-party study looking specifically at long hauler symptoms on a global basis. As I said, prior to this, everything is studies that are popping up that we're sort of stitching together. And what this study found is that it was looking at patients who might have had symptoms, might have been infected up to 7 months ago. So about 65% of the patients were dealing with long hauler symptoms 6 months out. Diarrhea was reported by 60% of the respondents. And what's interesting there, and what you don't know for sure until you get into clinical trials, but likely because diarrhea is something that you can observe, there's OTC medicines, that these are patients who probably, some of them tried OTC medicines and couldn't deal with it. So it's diarrhea despite opportunities to treat it that are out there over the counter. For long haulers that had symptoms more than 6 months, 20% were still dealing with diarrhea. Imagine diarrhea for over 6 months. And it makes sense that you're going to have inflammation in the GI tract because where the COVID-19 binds is to the ACE2 receptors, which are widely distributed in the small intestines as well as in the esophagus, as well as in the lungs, as well as in the kidneys. So where does the total population get? It's growing every single day. Some data puts the population that has been infected with COVID in the UK at over 25%. Another study another statement out of the World Health Organization is that probably 1 in 10 people are already infected, about 20 times more than is currently confirmed. In any event, it's a number that is growing and is growing with urgency. And so if we look at the opportunity here, we're not putting out forecasts, but if we just looked at 6 to 20% of the population infected over about a 10-year period of time, and went with just 1/3 of patients that had been infected dealing with long hauler syndrome, not the 65% from that study, and about 30% of those who are managing diarrhea, some quite acutely, some less than 6 months, and some 10% chronic, greater than 6 months, reference pricing in the United States. What this gets to is a blockbuster opportunity. Blockbuster in terms of the number of patients that can benefit, and blockbuster in the number of bottles, the amount of revenue that can be generated. And a population in Europe that is probably between 10 and 70 million people, and another 40 million people in the United States. So why are we focusing on Europe? As I said, Europe has defined this as a syndrome, and that's probably because of the single-payer healthcare system, where there is a great focus on mitigation of long-term chronic illness, both obviously the expense associated with it, but because this is a syndrome that is affecting primarily younger patient population, you have to think about the lifetime and the impact on the workforce and the career and the ongoing life, the wellness of a younger patient population. Because there are so many clinics that are already opened and focusing on this situation, this syndrome, that will facilitate any clinical enrollment that we need to do. Specifically, what we'd be looking for is a label for prophylaxis and or symptomatic relief of diarrhea due to inflammation, studied specifically in the post-COVID infection recovery patient population. Inflammatory diarrhea could be bigger than that, obviously Crohn's and colitis, but we'd specifically be studying it in the chronic COVID situation. And the endpoints that we would look at, learn from the vast clinical experience that we already have with this product, would be relief of diarrhea, prophylactically and symptomatically, reduction in the inflammatory gut markers, this would be a secondary endpoint, gut biome restoration, which is the same as a phase 4 study that we've just completed in HIV patients now. We're waiting for the readout, which will be very interesting. And also a reduction in viral fecal shedding, which can definitely affect the contagion factor and is similar to what we have seen, for example, in studies we've done in cholera patients. So what we've done now is we've started the process of seeking conditional approval, conditional marketing authorization from the EMA. And these are guidance words directly from the EMA website. So the EMA's conditional marketing authorization is being used to expedite the approval of safe and effective COVID-19 treatments where the benefit-risk balance for the medicine is positive. And they have 4 criteria. First, the benefit-risk balance of the medicine is positive. How does crofelemer fit in there? The safety of crofelemer is extraordinary. We've never had a clinical trial and dozens of clinical trials where the treated arm is different than the placebo arm. We've been on the market for many years and thousands of patients have never had a serious adverse event associated with the drug. Our drug is non-opioid. It's not a motility and therefore doesn't have the associated risk of constipation with antimotility agents like Imodium or loperamide. Part of the reason why the product is so safe, crofelemer, is it's locally acting in the gut. So you have no systemic exposure, no drug-drug interactions, no secondary metabolites that surprise you with adverse events a year later. Second criteria from the EMA, it is likely that the applicant will be able to provide comprehensive data post-authorization. We obviously have a full NDA, and Napo EU will have the license to use crofelemer for various indications within Europe. The medicine fulfills an unmet medical need. There's no other antidiarrheals approved for chronic use, and the first-in-class anti-secretory agent and activity of crofelemer is, we believe, appropriate for inflammatory diarrhea, certainly from the experience both in the clinical trials and commercialization of Mytesi right now in the HIV indication for which it's approved. And then last criteria, the potential benefit of the medicine's immediate availability to patients is greater than the inherent in the fact that additional data are still required. So the experience that we already have and the prophylaxis or early intervention of the long hauler syndrome is important to mitigate the onset of chronic diseases across the board for other organs as well. Okay, so Napo EU will, as I said, this is the cornerstone within Napo EU, which will have the license to crofelemer to the COVID-related inflammatory diarrhea indication. Napo EU is still going through the ministerial process of getting itself incorporated. Jaguar, the parent company, is already adding value. So the way we have done that is we have started the process to seek what is going to be required for conditional approval in the EMA. We brought on an international regulatory consultancy which has experience specifically with the EMA with fast track process. At the same time as we're preparing a package to have discussions with the EMA, we will branch out and broader go to Swissmedica and to the UK regulatory authorities. They're not part of the EU. Likely, we're going to enter the conversation and the interaction with the EMA through the German regulatory authorities, and that is where our international consulting firm is located. The value that this adds is, first and foremost, clarity on what is necessary and the timing of the clinical work. So is there a fast-track process for evaluation of our package, evaluation of clinical data? Is there a conditional approval that could occur based on interim data? Basically, clarity of what we'll need to do on the clinic and the time frame in order to achieve conditional marketing authorization in the EMA. At the same time, we will also pursue a discussion on the HIV-related indications, since that's something that's already approved and brings such great patient experience and real-world value to the discussion with the European regulatory authorities. So what is this SPAC all about? So Napo EU, as I mentioned, is willing and prepared to be the target of an international SPAC, specifically in Italy, where the SPAC can name the target. We've already done a Test the Waters roadshow in December, actually in person, before things completely shut down, in 4 different countries, 6 different cities, 150 institutional investors who I think were so pleased to be able to get out of their homes. And it went terrific. There's a great deal of interest in this opportunity. So Napo EU would have the exclusive license within Europe to all the regulatory information and all the intellectual property associated with crofelemer. And then these indications would be maintained based on the ability of Napo EU to pay license fees to the parent organization, and Napo EU would be able to do that based on its merger into a SPAC and getting the resources available from that merger. What Napo EU's obligation will be is to conduct the clinical trials to support the registration in Europe for the COVID-related inflammatory diarrhea indication. There'll be dedicated employees in Europe, but there will be joint management between the parent organization, which has 25 years experience developing this product, clinical trial design, understanding mechanism of action, regulatory discussions, and the operations team, implementation team in Europe, so that the direction is coming from the experience but the actual on-the-ground implementation is occurring with employees in Europe. Since there is an economy of scale associated with the manufacture of crofelemer, there will be centralized manufacturing that will be handled by the parent organization and will provide that product to Napo EU. And as I mentioned, Napo EU is expected to be incorporated in Italy probably in the next 2 weeks. It should be done. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how Mytesi works, and that explains why it has so many potential indications, so many populations that it can benefit. First, it's important for what it is not, and I did mention this, it's not systemically absorbed, and that goes a long way to explaining why the product is so safe. It is not an antimotility, which typically has constipation associated with it. Those are opioids, Imodium, loperamide. Loperamide have the risk factors associated with opioids. It's not an antibiotic, so you don't have resistance. It's not addictive, and it's the only antidiarrheal that is approved for chronic use. Specifically what it does, if this is a slices of gut, and the pink is epithelial cells and the white is the intestinal lumen, watery or secretory diarrhea occurs when you have an insult to the inside wall of the intestine, which could be a toxin, it could be a drug, it could be an inflammatory marker, cytokine from an overreaction of the immune system. And that'll set off lots of different pathways, but the common last step, which is sort of the holy grail in symptom management, the common last step is the active secretion of excess chloride ions, these little green dots, into the lumen of the intestine. That's essentially salt. Water comes in based on osmosis. That's the dehydration of the patient, and that's the watery diarrhea that goes out. So all the way on the right there, Mytesi, that little red dot, works locally to normalize the abnormal ion flow. If there's no abnormal ion flow, if we're perfectly normal, you could swallow a whole bottle of Mytesi and nothing happens. But if there's abnormal, Mytesi normalizes the ion flow, normalizes the water flow, and therefore specifically mitigates the dehydration without interfering with normal peristaltic activity, which may be necessary in complicated patients for absorbing their life-saving medicines, for example, in cancer patients or HIV patients. So we are selling the product ourselves in the United States for the specialty indication of HIV. And how are we doing? The pivotal trial in HIV, this was really fascinating. To get into the trial, patients had to have 7 watery stools a week. The average was 20, some had as many as 67. At the end of the trial, 83% of the patients had a 50% decrease in their watery stools, but over half of the patients had a 100% decrease of watery stools. That's of watery stools. That it doesn't mean constipation. They were able to get back to their normal bowel function. And how has that translated to commercial performance? It took us a while. It took us about 18 months or so to sort of figure out the reimbursement world. This is the first product that we were commercializing, and patient access and many of the barricades that come up with prior authorizations and co-pays. And so in April of last year, we implemented, after being informed from being on the market for 18 months, a patient access program, so that we have services, hub services that can help with prior authorizations, can sit on the telephone with insurance companies on behalf of patients, expanded co-pays, specialty pharmaceutical services, a whole slew of programs that we had no idea were going to get implemented just when lockdown was occurring. But nevertheless, that's the timing of when it happened. And even with our reps, for the most part, sheltered at home, which there's about 10 of them in the past year, we were able to increase gross sales almost tenfold in the third quarter of this year, or the second quarter and the third quarter of this year, and net sales about fourfold. And we're continuing to add more services on there. So we're quite pleased with that, and the school of hard knocks about the obstacles in the United States to get a product reimbursed. Okay, I'm going to talk just for a moment about the cancer therapy-related diarrhea indication, which is, as I mentioned, in a single pivotal trial right now in the United States. We worked with the FDA for about 18 months to gain agreement on the trial design, the enrollment criteria, the endpoints that are appropriate for an anti-secretory agent, again, based on our experience, clinical experience with this product for almost 25 years, statistics. And what we have from agreement from the FDA is that our safety studies are acceptable. We don't have to do any new non-clinical toxicity studies. We would expect that since we already have chronic approval for the product. We are doing the clinical trial literally with Mytesi, the exact same formulation, the exact same product. And this is the product that we take all the way from a rainforest to essentially any pharmacy in the United States. So we would expect, and as the FDA said, our CMC and our manufacturing data is acceptable. We also, since the product is not systemically absorbed, and we've shown no drug-drug interaction issues in the HIV patient population, we have no additional requirements for drug-drug interactions for the cancer therapy-related diarrhea program, which is very important because this is a basket approval. There are a couple of dozen cancer agents which we would be expected to be approved to be utilized with. So that could have been a very, very big program. The planned label, symptomatic relief, prophylaxis and symptomatic relief of diarrhea, is similar to what we're talking about with COVID-related diarrhea, in adult patients with solid tumors receiving targeted cancer therapies with or without cycle chemotherapy. And the principal investigator and principal investigators from MD Anderson and co-investigators are being added every single day. The trial has already started. Patients are already being dosed in this trial. Diarrhea is the #1 issue in cancer therapy side effects. You don't hear about it. Often you hear about chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, which is a market of over $2 billion worldwide. And those agents are used for about 3 days at the beginning of chemo cycles, whereas diarrhea, certainly in targeted therapy, adjuvant therapy, continues chronically for a year or two. And in some cases, patients have inflammation and distress in their GI system for years thereafter. So this is huge, again, blockbuster in terms of the number of patients that can benefit and the bottles that can be sold, the revenue that can come into the company. What we found in preclinical studies, dog studies that were done with human targeted agents, is that the patients had not only resolved their diarrhea, but also were able to stay on their drug therapy longer and were able to have less dose reductions. And this is drug holidays and dose reductions in your life-saving therapy. So not only the dignity and the comfort of the patient, but also potentially having a beneficial effect on outcomes of the chemotherapy of the patients. Another indication that we have going on, multiple shots on goal, is a cholera indication. Now, crofelemer has 2 publications that for treating cholera patients. What kills a cholera patient typically is the dehydration in the first 6 to 18 hours. That's called the death zone. So it's not the cholera infection. It's this rapid dehydration that occurs from those channels that I showed you in that previous slide being wide open all the time. So if you could, the KOLs feel that if you could decrease the dehydration, the water loss by about 1/3, that could be life-saving in terms of letting the patient get their own immune system up and going, getting rehydrated, getting to a place where they can get rehydration, where they can get clean water. And we were able to do that with statistical significance. Within the first 16 hours, show reduction of dehydration about 30%. What we've had trouble with is how do we turn this into a commercial opportunity? How do we provide a return to our shareholders? So the FDA has something called a Tropical Disease Priority Review Voucher, which is essentially a prize. Once you get the product approved for cholera, then you get this Priority Review Voucher, which requires the FDA to review any product on which this voucher is applied in 6 months, and they can be sold, and they have been sold, and the average price is about $133 million. So an immediate return on investment for getting approval for the cholera indication. There's one other catch, and that is that the Priority Review Voucher is only available for the first indication for which a product is approved. crofelemer is already approved. But we have a second generation anti-secretory agent that comes from the same plant, which is called crofelemer, which is about 1/10 the price to manufacture. And that is currently in preclinical development by the NIH. We're in the last stage of 30-day dog study, toxicity study, and then it'll go in clinical development. And we announced on one day last week, Friday or Thursday last week, that we have binding terms for a $6 million sale of a piece of the anticipated tropical disease priority review voucher, and that will fund the clinical development program. This is an acute indication, so $6 million will cover the clinical program. We'll follow the exact same path, the exact same location, the exact same principal investigator, the exact same clinical design that we had with the successful crofelemer study with crofelemer. So we're very excited to have this additional shot on goal. And crofelemer is also a potential long-term, lower-cost pipeline management for a proprietary collection of anti-secretory agents from Jaguar. We have a remarkable management team. We do a lot. We're the small, a little big pharmaceutical company. We are fully integrated and have about 40 people pulling this all off. We'll be growing this year. A couple of people that I will highlight: Dr. Stephen King. He's been with me for 31 years. He is responsible for the long-term, large-scale sustainable supply of the raw plant material from which we get crofelemer. And he is also pulling together Entheogen Therapeutics Initiative, which is the discovery program focused on psychedelics for mental health disorders and mood disorders. We have about 2,300 plants in our proprietary plant collection, many of which were deprioritized in the past because of psychoactive effects, which are now being put into a discovery program in the mental health area. Dr. Pravin Chettaveddy, he has 7 FDA-approved drugs to his name, including crofelemer, his favorite, and he designed the pivotal program that got Mytesi approved. He designed the pivotal program that is now going forward in cancer therapy-related diarrhea, and he is leading the effort right now for the inflammatory diarrhea in the COVID-related indication that we're pursuing with the EMA. Melissa Yeager, our head of regulatory, she has had a successful product in her career that has gone through conditional approval at the EMA, so obviously working hand in glove with Pravin on the scientific program right now for the COVID-related indication. Our board of directors is a nice combination of business, legal, investment. Jim Bucknowski, our chairman of the board, has also been with us for 31 years, and he's invested in almost every single round that this company has had. So we're so pleased to be working with him. And we're so pleased for all our stakeholders that our value is starting to be recognized. We landed in microcap land a couple of years ago, and we had to figure out how to deal with cleaning up warrants and cleaning up some of the structured deals that we've done. So we have a really nice clean balance sheet right now, really focused on long-term investors. About 40% of our investors are long-term investors. No warrants left that are in anybody's hands other than long-term investors, and our valuation is starting to recognize that. With our shares outstanding, that puts us at about a $400 million valuation at this time. And I will leave you then with the investment highlights while we go into the Q&A. I think I'm good on time here, but overall we have an FDA-approved product. Most products that have an NDA file fail because of safety issues or manufacturing issues. So our pipeline is risk mitigated because those issues are already taken care of. So a product within a pipeline has less risk than a pipeline of multiple different agents. This COVID-related diarrhea is the infection. The virus is moving with urgency, and we are moving with urgency as we see this as potentially having very, very long-term chronic effects on patients and on healthcare systems. We're thrilled to pieces that we can move forward with another shot on goal with crofelemer, with that funding for the priority review voucher. We have a leadership team that has been with us. About 10 people have been with us for over 15 years, 3 for over 30 years, and that's the core from which we'll expand to follow up on all these opportunities. We have global unencumbered rights to crofelemer. So we have multiple patient populations and multiple geographies that we want to benefit, and a white piece of paper to figure out how to put those partnerships in place and as efficiently as possible get this product to all the patients who need it. So that will be a very important activity, business development activity over the next 12 to 18 months. And then proprietary positioning, we have 144 patents that are issued, more that are filed on a regular basis. However, under botanical guidance, and we are the only oral product approved under botanical guidance, there is no pathway for a generic. So we essentially have exclusivity forever with this product. So thank you very much for listening, and let me know if there's any questions.
Thank you, Lisa. This is Nate Cali, Head of Healthcare Investment Banking. I'm filling in for Mike Heim. Thank you for such a great presentation. Very exciting time for a biotech company for where you guys are today. We'll try to get through everybody's questions. So has the company regained NASDAQ rule compliance at the moment?
We, on Friday, was our 10th day closing above $1, so we've met all the criteria.
Excellent, thank you. Has conditional emergency use in EU been processed? If so, what will be the timeline when it gets approved?
So that is, we don't have that answer yet. So right now we're preparing the package to have the conversation with them, which will elucidate the answers. So we don't yet have the answer, but we've started on the process.
Since you're selling part of your potentially selling part of your PRV, and you have other indications in your pipeline that could be attributed to additional priority review vouchers, can you sell under those indications as well different PRVs, like, for example, short bowel disease?
So that's a terrific question. So thank you for reminding me. The first thing I want to say is we can actually buy back the right that we're selling. We're selling 18% of the value of the PRV, but we can buy it back for a 12.5% return on the money, on the $6 million. So PRVs, and I don't know why the FDA decided on this, but they're only available for the first indication of a product. So we can't get it for crofelemer, for anything, for short bowel disease, for any orphan indication. And it's why, among other reasons, the other having to do with cost of goods, we moved to a separate product. Leclemer is a distinct product under botanical guidance so that it would qualify for the priority review voucher, and then you only get one. You know, if we took Leclemer into development for an orphan indication, we couldn't get another voucher.
But those usually going for an average right now of 133 million, and you're selling a piece of this, do you still expect to get that same value out of your PRV in the long run?
So the PRV, you know, if you look at the range of where they've sold, I think I can still play with my slides here, right? So there we go. So look at the range. You know, there was one that was sold in 2014 for 67 million, and then there's one in there for 350 million, I think. Because there's not a whole bunch of them, it is, so who needs it at the time that you're selling it, and how quickly do you need to sell it? So it's interesting. We're selling 18% of a number that we don't know. But as I mentioned, I can buy it back for a 12.5% return on the $6 million. So it's sort of a loan backed by an opportunity for a potential tropical disease voucher. Does that answer the question?
Yep. What is the timeline for the SPAC, and will the stockholders benefit from such a deal? And is the potential value $10, giving a Napo SPAC merger?
The Jaguar shareholders, the parent Jaguar Napo, so Napo EU is a separate subsidiary, Jaguar Napo in the United States. Of course, they benefit in multiple ways. One way is that it's not an acquisition by the SPAC, not anticipated to be an acquisition, it's a merger. So the Jaguar now has 100% of the anticipated Napo EU. It will have up to 50% some equity ownership in the SPAC merged entity. So that's number one, equity ownership. Number two, there are license fees that need to come from Napo EU to the parent organization to have the rights to develop different indications. So that's non-dilutive dollars that will come into the parent organization. And then it's additional resources to pursue the COVID-related indication, and all that data will be available to the parent organization to pursue in other parts of the world as well.